China has invested over $1 trillion since 2013 in their Belt and Road Initiative. This cash has been distributed to over 150 countries worldwide, developing economies to build infrastructure like refineries, mines, highways, convention centers, ports, bridges, and much, much more. And the transaction was very simple. We will loan you the money to build your infrastructure. And in the event, in the future, of a US-China rupture, you're going to take our side in terms of our global ambitions. This is now being stress tested in real time right in front of us. So I wanted to invite on Professor Richard Wolff to help me dissect the meaning and the implications of this scenario. Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Here's Professor Richard Wolff.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Professor Richard Wolff. Professor, it's great to have you back on the program. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Me too, and I enjoyed the last one.
All right, so here's where I want to start. Last we spoke was prior to the recent American election. So lots has changed, obviously, lots of new things to discuss. I want to focus on the United States-China relationship to begin and just get your high-level response to what you've seen thus far in what you might call an escalation in trade, economic, and geopolitical conflict. It seems like the two countries are playing a bit of a game of chicken, both playing a strong hand, both waiting for the other to concede something first. But as of the date that this will be published on Saturday, Scott Bessent, the United States Treasury Secretary, is in Switzerland meeting with the Vice Premier of China, maybe the first steps to getting something done. But what's been your perspective thus far, Professor? And then I'll pull on some threads.
Well, I think my focus is on the context of exactly the events you've just summarized. I'm trying to understand what's happening without getting lost in the weeds of every day. So that's what I'm about to tell you, what it looks like to me, thinking in terms of the election last November and everything that has transpired since that time. And I would say I thought then, and I feel more strongly now, that the larger picture of what we are seeing is the decline of the American empire and the rise of an alternative. The alternative is a little murky, or at least let's put it this way. A number of things are emerging, but exactly how they will play out in the sense of the alternative to a declining American empire is not yet clear. That's nobody's fault. It's just you need to see more in order to draw a conclusion. I'm reminded, as my friend Yanis Varoufakis has been saying recently, I'm reminded that when President Nixon, back in 1971, shocked the then world economy by taking the United States off the gold standard, by making tariffs, by the way, and all the other things he did in that memorable moment on August 15th of 1971, it took months. It took actually several years before you could make a judgment. What did that accomplish? How successful was it in reaching its goals? But having said all that as a caveat, here's what I think is emerging. China is making a decision, and it's making a decision between two paths. It has already achieved the momentous, and I say this with all seriousness, it has already achieved the momentous demonstration that its particular economic and political system can grow its economy faster than any other known combination in the history of the world. I mean, if the Chinese needed to prove that they had overcome 100 years of humiliation, that's one of their phrases, well, then what they call themselves, socialism with Chinese characteristics, has overcome that humiliation in a way that means they don't have to feel humiliated in the foreseeable future. They are sitting on top of a successful effort, at least now 40 years old, if not older, that has shown the vast majority of the countries of our planet, if you're poor, if you have under colonialism or for whatever reasons, seen economic development elude you, you now have a model of how to do it. You may not choose to follow that. Of course, that's open, but there is a model for you against which no other model can hold a candle. And that reality, which I believe most Americans, I'm talking to you from New York City. I am an American. I was born here. I've lived here all my life, worked here. Most Americans are not yet able to see it. They're not yet able to admit it. It's an extraordinary problem, and that predates Mr. Trump. Whatever you want to blame him for, you can't blame him for that. That was there before he got there. He joins it, but he's not to blame for it. And so the Chinese are at a point of deciding between two large paths. Are they going to proceed and by virtue of what they've achieved, become the next empire, so that we will be looking back generation from now at the last century was the passing of the British and the arrival of the American. This century, or the last 2 centuries, the coming to the top of the American. And now we pass the torch, if you like, to the Chinese. That's one path. They may take it. The other path is not to do that, to literally understand the last 2 or 3 centuries as a kind of lesson, the lesson older than the human race, that every empire that enjoys the ride up to its global dominance then has to suffer the ride down to the decline and disappearance of that empire. We visit the pyramids in Egypt to look at the ruined leftover of another empire. We do it at the Parthenon in Greece. We do it at the Colosseum in Rome, and on and on and on. And the Chinese, who have had more than one empire in their long history, may be able to see that it would be worth avoiding the decline by simply saying, we're not going to do it again. We're going to learn from human history, including the history of the United States, the history of Britain, the history of Persia, the history and all the others. And we're going to actually try to establish a global community, a multinational sharing of this planet's resources, which includes cultivating, ecologically speaking, that we don't abuse those resources, which has to be a collective project if it's going to work anyway. There may now be, between the ecological recognitions and all the rest, enough of the conditions that the Chinese might take that second path. At this point, I can see the paths, I see the conversations, but I can't yet tell you that they've made that choice. I don't think they have. I think they are busy consolidating and carefully managing their own emergence. And they're doing it very successfully. And I have to say, the success they're showing is matched by the frustration in the United States and Western Europe and Japan, the frustration at having been unable to stop it, unable to slow it, and certainly unable to reverse it, which has been their approach, at least to this point.
Okay. Thank you for that. So first of all, I appreciate the context that these events take decades to fully understand the ripple effect, and that's a great place to start. Reflecting on your comments about, with the ride up of an empire guarantees the ride down, and you used a handful of examples, and I found myself thinking, the Chinese, not in recent memory, but in collective memory, can remember that too, right? 16th, 17th century, the most innovative economy and empire in the world, followed by the century of humiliation that you led to. So they've lived that, in their collective memory. And I hadn't thought about those two paths, but I want to pull on that for sure. Before I do, just a question. You talked about the economic models we've seen, and we touched on this in our first interview. We've seen the rise and the fall of a true socialist economy with the Soviet Union, the rise of a true capitalist economy with the Americans, and China runs a kind of hybrid model, socialist, capitalist, and that you could look at that today and say, this seems to be the winning formula because for the last 40 years, this economy has been a rocket ship. My question for you there would be, but 40 years isn't that long of a time. And could it be that as hot out the gate as China's been since the early 1990s, without the democratic self-correcting mechanism that slows growth in the short term, but maybe preserves it in the long term? Do we need more time to tell if this has the longevity over more than a 40-year time period? Is it too early to make that call? Professor, what do you think?
Well, normally I would say, yes, it's too early. It's not enough. I mean, I understand your point. Normally I would say, yes, that's the way to understand it. But the problem is what you count as enough time is not an absolute. It's not measured in, the passage of so many calendar days or weeks or months or years. It's measured in part by what goes on in a society. And that's where the Chinese are so remarkable. Yeah, 40 years normally wouldn't be enough. But what they've accomplished in their 40 years is so overwhelming. I mean, let's be clear. They made a move from abject poverty to being a superpower literally capable of competing with the United States, something which took Britain 4 centuries, took the United States arguably 2.5, and they did it in 40 years. So we are looking at something which normally, 40 years not enough. And look, I can't predict the future any more than anybody else can. I have no guarantees. But from 40 years, looking at it, wow. I mean, I'm overwhelmed. The kind of questions that I come to with your approach just now, which I think is perfectly reasonable, go like this. What happens to the human brain when you put people through a transition in that short a time? Because we're still, human beings. We have muscles and brains and cells that take time to digest the food and process what comes into our eyes and our 5 senses. And I wonder to myself, parenthetically, I'm married to a psychotherapist, so these kinds of questions are part of my life. I wonder what it means when you learn that in one generation, hundreds of millions of people stopped being agricultural, rural in their lives to become industrial and urban in their lives. This normally reorients notions of husband, wife, parent, child, male, female, older, younger, educated. How is all of that amount of change affecting the human beings one by one in their relationships, which in the end will, as I think your question suggests, have its effect. So let me put it another way. They've done unbelievable in their economic and political organization, their urbanization, look at their transport systems, the rapid trains that tie every corner of China together. I use the American training system. It's 100 years old. It's 100 years behind the Chinese. I mean, it's staggering what they have done. But I wonder, will there be in the years ahead a kind of blowback into the consciousness, the mentality of the Chinese people as each man, woman, child, parent adjusts, let's call it, to the structural changes? Will the Communist Party that has led all of this and deserves the credit which we can't in America give them, but they deserve the credit for something which the whole world will have to acknowledge sooner or later, will they survive? Will they have unchained a process they cannot control because it's working its way out in the minds and personalities of 1.5 billion Chinese by this time? So those are the questions about time and how what they've achieved can react and develop their society. And look, they may end up showing us in the decades ahead another level of stupendous achievement we can't even guess at yet, because they have so original a problem for their people to process. And by the way, if we had a sane world, if the kinds of conversations that were announced yesterday taking place in Switzerland between high-level officials, if that were a sign, which I'm not sure it is, but of a different mindset, then we might look at the world and feel much better about ourselves globally, because these two giants, the old empire and quote unquote the new one, might be actually getting together to learn from each other, to help each other navigate their different economic problems going forward. That would make me, and I think an awful lot of other people, feel a lot less anxious and a lot more hopeful about where we could be going.
Now, the mining industry specifically is filled with complex jargon and terminology that confuses investors. So we went ahead and built a course that demystifies all of that complexity. It's called Mining Companies 101. Check it out today.
That's really interesting and such an optimistic thought. And I think, you know, there's what would prevent that? You know, if I think about so many of the narratives that get a president elected, very often step one is identify an enemy and then unite against them, right? And that's clearly like a playbook we see on repeat. It's in play today. And it makes me wonder, you know, how much of this is actual substance versus just political rhetoric. I mean, the Panama Canal might be a sort of real case study example. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. This was major headline. We didn't give the Panama Canal to China. They have it now. We need to take it back. BlackRock's good. Was that actually a threat? Like, was there really anything there? Let's start with that. And I wonder, as you're talking about the downside of becoming the world's superpower from China's perspective, they may understand that and therefore be hesitant to pursue that course. Instead, maybe pursue some kind of collective harmony globally, but it takes two to tango, and one seems very antagonistic, despite how the other may be acting. What do you think?
Okay, it's a wonderful question, and I think you've laid it out the way it needs to be laid out. First of all, the reality and then how people are working with it. The reality is that for all practical purposes, it's a little bit like the war in Ukraine. I understand the passions. I understand the disagreements. I really do. But that's not an excuse, understanding them, for being blind about what's going on. What's going on is a war. On the one hand, there is Russia, who invaded in February of 2022. On the other side is Ukraine, armed and funded and supported right down to the last nickel by the West, by Western Europe and the United States. Number one. The rest is make-believe. Number two, Russia's winning and the other side is losing. That's what happens in wars, usually. Not always, but usually. And I don't see any end to that. Whether the United States stays in at the level it has been or withdraws, as Trump has hinted, whether the Europeans step up, as their rhetoric suggests, I don't think it matters. That war's over. It may take another year or two for the rest of the world to be in. It's over. And I think it's sort of tragic that so many, especially on the losing side, which is normal, can't see it. I have to pretend, have to deny, have to look the other way, have to exaggerate the few moments when a Ukrainian missile bothers them in Moscow. Stop. This is childish. It's sort of, anyway, why am I saying that? Because something like that is going on here. The Chinese joined the competition. I'll give you one example. 10 or 15 years ago, to develop the new automobile. The automobile for the last century has been the key thing of your economy. When the Japanese tried, after being defeated in World War II, when they tried to build back their economy to recover from World War II, they focused on what is the symbol of capitalist success, and the answer was Detroit and automobiles. Ford, General Motors, what's now called Stellantis, used to be Chrysler. And important in Canada, the Lord knows now, as well as in the United States. And the Japanese understood that to recover in a world dominated by American capitalism, you had to produce either better or cheaper, or best of all, both. Otherwise, you weren't going to make it. They did. They did. That's why we in America, I don't know how Canada works, but we in America drive overwhelmingly Japanese cars. The Toyota, the Nissan, all of that. All right, 10 or 15 years ago, the Chinese, very acutely aware of what I just said about Japanese automobile, set to work much more broadly, but still heavily focused on the automobile. And how? They took it, because it's a different moment, that their goal was to produce the best quality, lowest price, electrically fueled automobile rather than the fossil fuel. Okay, fast forward. Today, as I'm speaking to you, the whole world knows that the best quality electric car at the lowest price is not an American car. And it's not a Japanese car. It is a Chinese car. And it's produced by the BYD Corporation, which is one of about 30 car companies busily competing to get going. But they've dominated the market. And if you go to Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe, BYD cars and trucks are everywhere, as of course they will continue to be. and here's a little footnote to understand it. Every company in the world that needs vehicles, either to bring its inputs to their production sites or to take their output to the market from their production sites, is buying the best car and truck to do that. And that's the BYD. But there's one country where you can't, if you're a capitalist looking to get the best quality truck or car for your business, there's one country where you can't do it. There's one country where there are no BYD trucks and cars on the road. I live in that country, the United States. Why? Because Mr. Trump, in his first presidency, put a 27.5% tariff on BYD, electric vehicles from China. And Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. So that a $30,000 Chinese BYD vehicle arriving in the United States, if that happened, it doesn't, but if it happened, would require every American buyer to pay not only $30,000 to go to China to pay for the vehicle, but another $30,000, 100%, of a tax to Uncle Sam, so that the net cost to the American buyer would be $60,000. And they're not going to do that because they can get a $50,000 electric vehicle from Ford or GM or Toyota or Tesla, which is collapsing because it cannot compete with the Chinese. Can't compete here, can't compete in China, where Tesla has a significant position. Okay, why do I tell you this story? Because it's a cutting edge technology? Yes. Because it's a key commodity in the modern world? Absolutely yes. And the Chinese dominate. And a couple of weeks ago, they added another domination. They produced the best lithium battery. Take you about 5 minutes using this battery to charge their truck or car. That's less time than it takes you to put gasoline in it. The so-called problem of charging has been solved. And who solved it? They did. Okay, I tell you this because I think it's over. The Chinese are not going to go away. The notion, which, by the way, came from several American presidents, that we are dealing with them so that they see the wisdom of the Western world and adjust their internal civil liberties and civil rights. None of that is going. That's all gibberish. What the last 40 years have shown the Chinese government is that what they're doing is exactly what they hoped for. There's no reason on God's green earth that they would change their system to make it look like what? To match what? They're the top of the heap. Everybody else's job is to learn from them. I'm exaggerating. They can learn from us also. But, I mean, let's be real here. You don't hear the Chinese having a conversation. If only we trade with the United States, we can get them to be like us. Stop it. This is junk. And you know, after a certain point, you can excuse it. Oh, it's public relations. Yeah, but you know who ends up? It's the old story my mother used to tell me. You don't tell lies because after a while, you, the liar, lose the ability to understand the difference. And nobody trusts you. You know, the lesson parents have to often teach their children. And that I have 2 kids and I try to teach them myself. So long way to get to this point. What you're getting from the West, and it's not just the United States, you get a lot of this from Europeans. You know, I don't study what the leaders in Canada have said, but I did notice a few things Mr. Trudeau said. But in any case, most of Western leaders are frustrated. They didn't understand it. They didn't expect it. China kind of was off the radar other than a very poor, large Asian country. And now it has sort of exploded into the modern world. And they're not ready, and they're frustrated, and there's nothing they can do. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe we need to talk about that. They have their nuclear weapons. They have 1.25 or 1.5 billion people. They're building up their military, which everyone knew they would. In fact, it took them longer to do it than they should have, given their relative importance. But they have a very well-armed ally in Russia. Russians are showing us just how well armed they are for conventional war, let alone the unthinkable nuclear war. So what you're picking up is frustration. The United States can't be itself because it has China. Let me ask you almost to sympathize with us here in the United States. We've had no economic competitor for a century. I like to remind people, the Soviet Union, when it was alive, may, and I underscore may have been a military competitor, may even have been a political competitor, although that's a stretch. But an economic competitor, absolutely not, never, not at any moment in any way. I mean, even today, the GDP, which is that gross number that economists use, it's a calculation of the output of goods and services in a 12-month calendar year, the GD, gross domestic product. Okay, it gives you an idea of the economic footprint of a country in the world. And so we keep track of the GDPs of all 180 countries or whatever it is now. All right, the GDP of the United States right now, depending on how you count, 27, 28 trillion dollars. I mean, it's unthinkable, I know, but just as a number. What is the GDP of Russia right now after they've been doing quite well for a while? Maybe 4, 3.5. Do you understand? That's an elephant and a mouse. That's not an economic issue. One of the reasons the Soviet Union fell is because they were engaged in an arms race with the United States. Now, this is ridiculous. That's as if I were an expert marksman and I provoked you to a duel. And I said to you, you can choose the weapons, and you chose the one I'm an expert in. What? You know, this would be self-destructive on your part. You wouldn't do it. An arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States was the Soviet Union being forced, because it would never have chosen it, into a race with another player who had every advantage in winning that race, which they did. And then the Soviet Union imploded because it couldn't do it. Now, that's a completely different situation from what we have now. The GDP of China is right now, having given you just now Russia's at 3 to 4, the Chinese is calculated at 18 to 19. Still far short of the United States, no doubt. But light years ahead of Russia and light years ahead of any other country in the world. It's a race between between China and the United States, and one of them has been slowing down for the last 4 decades, and the other one has been speeding up, and there's no end in sight in that disparity. In the year 2024, according to the International Monetary Fund, a Western institution, the economic growth of the United States was 2.8%, which was better than the economic growth of any other country in the G7, Western Europe or North America. Germany, the other powerhouse economy, is in recession. It doesn't have a positive economic growth. It's declining, and also gives no sign of changing that. What does the IMF say the economic growth was in 2024 of the GDP of China? Plus 5%, double what the United States was. India, a very close ally now of China and Russia, grew at 7%. Okay. In other words, the disparity isn't going away. It's solidly embedded. And so what you're getting with Mr. Trump, and really should not make a mistake, and you folks should know it, especially because all of the blather about Canada. What is this Mr. Trump is a cheerleader here. He's a cheerleader for denialism. He's a cheerleader for helping Americans avoid confronting what the reality is. And how better to do that than to act as though the reality were opposite what it is. So we are going to take the Panama Canal. We are going to take Greenland. We're going to make Canada the 51st state. We're going to grandiosity. Again, you need psychotherapy to help you here. This is the grandiosity of someone who's afraid of what's actually happening to them and making themselves or trying to feel better by doing the opposite. And by the way, there's a certain tone deafness here. If you know anything about the mentality of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, it's anti-colonialist. They are still working their ways out of centuries of colonial oppression from the West. To hear the leader of the West talk blithely about taking parts of it is bad news on a scale that even your average Madison Avenue advertising mentality would recognize for being self-destructive indulgence of something you shouldn't do when you're drunk, let alone when you're sober. This is not smart at all. And I'm not even going to go into what it has done. And I know about this. It has done to Mexican public opinion because of what he did there, what I have already been reading about, what it has done to Canadian public opinion. And I watched yesterday or the day before when your new leader in Canada was sitting in the Oval Office next to President Trump. And I watched the body language, but I don't know if you noticed it, if you saw that, but you could see he didn't know that your Canadian leader, what he was getting into. And so he would lie. Did you notice he tried several times to sort of break in to the theatric of Mr. Trump, but he's a polite man. He's not used to it. So he didn't, but it ended up making him look in a way Mr. Trump wanted him to, that he hesitant, shrinking a little bit, hesitant to push. And so Mr. Trump did all the theatrical pushing, and you know, I'm sure it leaves bitterness in the feelings of many Canadians. If I were a Canadian, I would. This was you went to pay your respects. You went early on in your new administration, and you got shown the back door in this little arrangement. But that's part of the theatric here. Anybody who comes here, that's what you're going to get. Starmer came and was treated secondarily. Macron came, he was treated secondarily. Zelensky was yelled at. Childishness. But you need to understand this is a childishness that is extremely important to the American people in this obtuse way that it affirms the very position we're losing. And that's the denial that still is the governing mentality as this empire goes down.
I love that term, the cheerleader for deniability. And yeah, as I was watching that meeting, I thought, it is a tough situation for Macron, for Starmer, for Carney, for Zelensky, but by design. You're in a room. It's not you and the president. It's you, the president, and a dozen cameras and microphones, plus
Absolutely.
Rubio, Besant, Vance. The whole team is there, right? And I think theatrics is a great theatrical tool to communicate American sentiment. I want to get to your example of BYD. I think that's such a great example of innovative success, but more importantly, how they've broken markets all over Latin America. Broken into markets all over Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa.
Yep.
And it strikes me, what I want to ask you, Professor, is that seems to me a consequence of the success of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Since 2013, $1 trillion has been invested into 150 countries all over Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, building ports, refineries, mines, highways, convention centers, you name it. But it struck me that there's been two goals behind the Belt and Road Initiative. The first is to open up those markets to Chinese goods, which has been proven successful with examples like BYD and now batteries. But the second goal, if there was one, was that in the event of a US-China rupture, those countries would support China's ambitions over America's. And I think whether or not that proves true, that's being stress tested right now.
Yep.
What do you think of that analysis, the intention of the BRI, the results of it? So far, so good. But now it's being stress tested from the geopolitical standpoint. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. I have nothing to add. I think you've captured it exactly. It's clear to me that the Chinese were understood all of this, that this, when they planned out to do it this way, that they understood this was the necessary economic accompaniment to their foreign policy. Their foreign, I'm going to exaggerate now, but for simplicity and for time reasons, they understood that they had to break into a global system dominated by the American empire, and that's a very real problem. They couldn't expect to do it with their Marxist ideology. They couldn't expect to do it with the fact that they are a big country, population-wise. They couldn't do it that they were politically in some way a relevant, exciting option. A little of that, but that they knew they had to make an economic issue. In that way, they copied from the United States. The United States took the economic catastrophe of World War II and said to the world, we came through it without a catastrophe. We will now help you recover. We will buy your products. We will lend you tons of money. We will make the world safe for ships to move around. We'll hold back the nasty Soviets so they can't interfere with you. We're it. We're the economic core, and so you better be respectful of our politics, our ideology. And so everybody in the world decided that denim was the right material for your pants. That was the United States power in that situation. The Chinese figured we have to do something economically if we want to prevail. And by prevail, I mean survive the United States, given its military and political dominance, and the fact that it will be hostile because the revolution of 1949 was achieved by a communist and a communist party operating its own eighth root army that did the work and defeated our little man there, Chiang Kai-shek, forcing him to take his bedraggled elite off to Taiwan and try to make a life there. And we've seen how that's evolved, right? So I think you're right. The Belt and Road did that. And it did it exactly the way the United States did it. It taught everybody, you want the help of the Chinese. The Chinese are now a powerhouse economically. The way I explain it to my students, because I teach in the university, is I say every third world government, what we used to call the third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, so on, when they need to have a railroad built or a port built or a health system funded or a university system grounded, they used to go to Washington or London or Paris and present their project and hope for help. They do that. They still go there. But instead of coming home after they go there, they go to Beijing or New Delhi or Sao Paulo, Brazil, and they present the same project. And then they do what now can be done. They play the two against each other. That's what you and I would do if we were Paraguayans looking for help, or Nigerians, right, or Malaysians. But here's the problem. If you add up the GDP of China and the BRICS, their alliance, carefully cultivated, it's about 35% of global GDP. If you add up the United States and the G7, its key allies, which include Canada, it's about 29% of global GDP. The Chinese are a bigger, richer economic bloc than the old one. If you wanted a single statistic that captures what has happened to the global economy, I just gave it to you. And I didn't make these numbers. These are all numbers from reputable sources. You know, I'm a professor. I publish a lot of books and articles. I know how the game is played. I know where I have to take my sources from to avoid being held accountable for fudging the numbers or anything like that. So these are IMF or World Bank or other UN numbers that everybody uses. And I can tell you, that's why I say, partly to be provocative, but also to be accurate, the competition is largely over. They've passed the milestones. Now the question is, how are the two sides, when the competition between them is pretty much over, how are they going to react? What are the Chinese going to do with the situation, the position they've accomplished? And what is the United States going to do with the position the Chinese have accomplished? And what you're watching is the early phases, I think it's fair to say, the early phase of the United States. It pretended for much of the last 25 years that I've been personally involved in, it pretended that what was going on in China wasn't happening. I cannot tell you how many conferences I attended, how many seminars. I was often a participant, a panelist, and I heard and listened to politely my colleagues explaining to the audience that the statistics coming out from China were not true, that this was communist propaganda or statistical manipulation, or on and you know, I have to admit, when I first heard it, I wondered, well, you know, I'm aware that statistics can be manipulated. It happens in this country. It certainly can happen in China. Why not? But, you know, as the years passed and as my colleagues went to China and came back with their photographs of everything that had amazed them, I began to learn that, in fact, the statistics weren't far off. You know, so we're beyond that. We don't do that anymore. My professors are no longer talking about how in China it's nothing. Here's another thing they're not doing. They used to say, when they had to face that it was impressive, that the only reason it was impressive was because of the opening to private capitalism. That at a certain point, the Chinese leadership welcomed private capitalist enterprises run both by Chinese citizens, but also by Europeans, Americans, Japanese, anybody who wanted to come. Now, it is true that the Chinese leadership did that. It is true that the economy is about a 50-50 split between government-owned and operated enterprises on the one hand and privately owned and operated. They have a stock market, they have billionaires, they have the apparatus of private capitalism. And did that participate in their achievement? Absolutely. But so did the half that's government-owned and operated. So did the Communist Party, that is the supervisory apparatus coordinating. When my students raise their hand and say, what does coordinating mean? I could tell them it'd take me a semester to take you through it. But here's a summary. The Communist Party says, if the private sector can take care of this activity, then we are happy. You go do it. And if you can make a fortune when you do it, you can keep your fortune. You can be Jack Ma. You can be a billionaire entrepreneurial type. That's okay. You can amass enormous personal wealth and quite a bit of personal power. But if you can't do it, if you won't do it, if it isn't privately profitable, but we think the Chinese economy needs it, then we're going to have it done by the government. And you're going to have to live with a missed opportunity, maybe. Maybe you'll be glad you didn't do it. But now, the modern China we have is the product of all of that. You can't say, it's all the doing of the public sector. That would be stupid. But to say it's all the doing of the private sector, that's equally stupid. What their genius is the combination and making it work that well. That's the trick. Here in the United States, by contrast, everything depends on whether it's privately profitable. Even the ideology governing the United States says it doesn't want it done, even if the private profit calculation makes it not happen. The government shouldn't. It's considered a value of the society not to have the government step in. So, do we have a modern railroad system? No. The privates don't want to spend the money, and the public won't step in. So we don't have it. That's all. We don't have it. I live and work in the most developed rail corridor in the country. It's the one that runs from Boston in the north to Washington, D.C. In the mid-Atlantic. Our trains break down. I can't be sure when I step in the train for an hour and a half ride, whether I'll be there in an hour and a half or in 2 hours or in 4 hours or until the next day. The standard joke on that train among the people who sit on it, which in the many thousands, we are in a third world country. That's the joke that passes from one corporate executive on Wall Street sitting in the train to another. And everybody giggles, even though the joke by now is very old and has been repeated a thousand. But none of them takes it to the next step. None of those executives can, at this point, say, okay, the private sector has failed. And so we're going to turn to they can't do that. They can't say that. Those words, when they maybe start welling up somewhere in their brain, some other part of the brain comes in and shuts that down. That must not be spoken. It's almost as if you turn to the executive sipping the cocktail next to you in the train and started discussing the intimacies of your sex life. That's not going to happen because of the taboos of a culture. It's not that these topics aren't important. It's not that we're not aware that they're there. We all are. But it's the agreed social convention to act as if they weren't there. And when you see with your frustration a remark like, Governor,
Trudeau.
Didn't he call your leader governor for a while there?
Yeah. Of the 51st state, Governor Trudeau. Yeah.
This is, for Americans, an adorable naughty boy behavior.
Right.
They kind of know it transgresses, but they're titillated by it. Look how we can transform the country to our north into another state. It's downright exciting because it's such a nice offset to what's happening in most of the rest of the world.
Right. And that was very effective at impacting Canadian sentiment. And it honestly blew my mind because the whole concept was so foolish. I mean, I'm sort of politically homeless inside of Canada, but it's a very liberal country. And the same voter base that elected Trump is now going to cheer in favor of importing 40 million Democratic voters. That's what Canada would do, by the way, if you were to annex Canada. Like, it would be the death blow to the Republican Party. So none of it ever made any logical sense. But it's amazing how much airtime it took up, even at the meeting last week with Prime Minister Carney and President Trump. They came up 2 or 3 times, and I was blown away that reporters were still asking that question. But I get it. It's not about substantive information. It's about headlines and theatrics, and that fits the bill completely. Let me ask you one more question on the, Belt and Road Initiative, and maybe we're at that sort of stress test moment. You could make the so Belt and Road Initiative spread out between 150 countries, $1 trillion invested. The idea here was that we're going to buy access to these economic markets. That's worked. But today, a lot of those loans are sort of coming due, and 80% of the countries within which they've been made are in financial distress. And I wonder if, and also, I'm not sure if you've noticed this, quite frankly, it was off my radar, but absent a few articles that came out this week, the amount of Chinese economic data that's just begun vanishing from public forums like land sales, foreign investment, unemployment, birth rates, loan defaults on real estate, production numbers down to the annual production of soy sauce suddenly disappearing. So I read this and I think, as an entrepreneur, there's been up years and down years over the last 15 years. There's years where I'm confidently sharing our books with the whole team. And there's years where I'm absolutely not doing that. Those aren't the good years, right? Those are the years I'm holding the cards close to my chest and finding other ways to motivate the team. But so looking at the maturation of so many of these loans and the financial distress of so many of these countries paired with this sudden concealment of so many core data points that used to be public, you could speculate and run with that a little bit and say, is this a bit of a paper tiger scenario that we're overlooking? But that may be hyperbolic in its own sense. What do you think, Professor?
No, I think it's a perfectly reasonable question to raise. I don't know if they've given some answer as to why the data aren't there or not available to the public. But your speculation about what that might mean makes sense to me. If, for example, if you were worried, I don't have any privy information, so I'm not, no games here. I'm just guessing. But if you were about to face a situation where many of the countries to whom you had made loans, granted that the loans were made in order then to pay for the Chinese to come in and build your railroad. So you got a loan, the Marshall Plan of the United States done by China, more or less.
Yes. Yes.
You might be wanting to forgive the loan in the way that there are conservative politicians in the United States who like to remind audiences that many European countries never paid back the Marshall Plan loans that were given to them. And then they have to have a liberal explain to them that the point of the loan was not to get repaid. The point of the loan was two things: to enable France, Germany, and so forth to rebuild their shattered economies. And equally important, it was felt that if you didn't do that, the communists inside those countries, and I mean Britain, France, and Germany, the first post-war government in France, Americans don't know the history, the first post-war government under General de Gaulle, who was their great leader, included several cabinet positions held by the Communist Party of France, because they had been the backbone of the anti-Nazi resistance, and nobody could have stopped them anyway. I mean, they came that close to revolution. They did in Italy also. And they could have destabilized Western Germany easily. So the question had to be, well, we don't care whether you ever repay the loan. Here's money for jobs. Here's the equipment to give people the means to rebuild. And you, the non-communist, you will be in charge. You will get the money, and you will hire the work, and you will rebuild your country as an ally of the United States. Okay, I understand that. I saw the process myself, part of my life. But the Chinese are doing that too, and I can see if they have a problem, and I don't know that they do, but if they have a problem explaining all this to their own people, then maybe they want to keep the whole details under wraps for a while until it's a sort of done deal, and then return, like the way you put it, in a good year to go back to the data. Or maybe they've had a slowdown in their economic growth, and they don't want that to be noticed. They don't want to show Mr. Trump that his tariff war is hurting them. All of these things, could they motivate this sort of thing? Absolutely. And I know, I really do, because I teach it. I know what statistics are, and I know what statistics are not. It is very easy to fool around with statistics in ways that really only the statisticians know. Every in case it's of interest to your audience, every statistic starts with a question being asked to somebody, a corporate executive, a government official. You ask, how many acres did you farm this year? How many bushels of corn did you get? Well, to imagine that the answer that comes out of that farmer's mouth is always a question of getting it right is just naive. That farmer knows that that information is very interesting to his banker. He knows it's very interesting to the owner of the land. And he takes all of that into account. If he's an honest person, he knows he's doing that. If he's a bit of a fudger, then he doesn't want to talk about that. He just wants to do it because he knows that his loans could be in trouble. Okay, we then, as statisticians, we try to filter. We make adjustments. We make assumptions. We shave the number that, not necessarily with some evil intent, but trying to make sense of what is always fudgy. So when you see the beautiful table in the government document that you can photocopy or nowadays use electronically and put it in your article, look at it. If you're honest, you'll always hedge it about with what the reader of your report will find frustrating. Caveats, ways in which you're saying it could be read this way, but it could also be. That's actually honest. When you get this straight out, here it is, this proves it, you're dealing with a person who should know better and who's either a dishonest person or a person who hasn't learned the skill of this business very well, because statistics never prove anything. They validate a perspective. That's different.
That's so key to recognize. I think that's like almost been the theme of our entire conversation has been truth versus validating perspective, right?
That's
And yeah, you're right. Look at the CPI number that we all seem to rely on and the formula we use to create that number over the last 20 years and how the inputs just adjust as needed, right? Unemployment, the same thing.
Absolutely. Look, I've been at meetings of the American Economic Association, which is the kind of parent association that economists are members of here, includes folks in Canada. I've been at countless panels where there's a debate about these numbers, that we have half a dozen inflation numbers. Which ones do we use? Why do they differ? What does that teach us? And it's a constant debate. It's not as though that debate has ever been resolved. People come to each year, and I noticed it across my career, with as much passion for or against this number versus that one, what the Department of what the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out on the one hand versus the Fed numbers on the other. They're partisans, and they're partisans for reasons. We sit there and we see the logic of what, but we're often left in the kind of a limbo. And since an argument can rise or fall on which number you use, you're stuck. If you're honest, you're stuck. And you should say, well, from this perspective, it looks that way. And from that perspective, without telling everybody there's only one perspective, this is the way it is. Don't do that. That makes you a shyster, not an honest person trying to figure out what we're all trying to figure out, which is what is happening. That's why a good course in statistics, after it teaches you regression analysis and least squares and all the other apparatus of that, it should always end with a lecture by the teacher saying, qualitative evidence is every bit as important as quantitative evidence ever was. If you do only quality and never looked at the quantity, you're missing a lot. But the vice versa also applies. We need, and then a good professor like mine did, we need the poets, we need the troubadours, we need the painters, we need the rock stars, because in that song can be a better grasp of what's going on than the table from the Bureau of Labor Statistics will ever do. It's an important corrective.
Yeah, I love that. The qualitative analysis. You need the artists and their story, right?
Absolutely.
To get the whole picture.
Absolutely.
I love it. Professor, I want to thank you for coming back on my show today. It's always so much fun to chat with you, and I learn a lot. So thank you once again, and I look forward to doing it again.
Me too. And let me ask you, if you send me a link, we'd be glad to post it and promote it on our social media. We do a lot of that work, and people would, I think, be interested in what we've just discussed.
Okay, 100%. Yeah, we publish this Saturday. I'll make sure you guys get the link and appreciate that.
Okay, talk to you again in the future.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.
Most investors think they're playing it safe, following mainstream advice, chasing trends, and clinging to the herd mentality. But there is nothing safe about mainstream advice. The smartest investors know that real wins come from thinking independently and spotting opportunities long before the crowd. And that's what we teach at the Commodity University. This is an exclusive membership designed to arm you with the skills from the sharpest minds in the mining investment world. Each of our professionals has a proven track record of finding trends before anyone else. At the Commodity University, you'll gain access to a highly curated and growing catalog of courses covering what you actually need to know to become an informed commodity investor. Every single month, you'll receive a brand new course packed with insights from the best in the business, giving you the edge to stay ahead. If you're tired of following the crowd and ready to invest smarter, think sharper, and understand the mining industry like the professionals, then take the next step and join the Commodity University today.